Well, it's obviously a very, very big problem, and the rate of heroin addiction and opiate abuse has risen multiple times, you know, just tripled in the last few years, especially the last 5 years. And especially in Mason County, it's a very, very big problem, and of course impacts law enforcement and all the other social services in Mason County. So I think that having law enforcement more aware of the problem, giving them the support that they need financially. There has been some controversy in Mason County Sheriff's Department about financing. And of course, a lot of the crime is related to drug-related problems. So I think that making sure that our law enforcement has the adequate funds needed to address the problems. Treatment centers, of course, are a very big problem. Again, jails are not treatment centers. And so to have the medical and mental health facilities available for drug problems is very important. I have talked to KCR, Kitsap County Resources. I know that they are active in this. Homelessness, lack of jobs, drug abuse. We have a huge veteran population here. Many of them actually live in Mason County, and a lot of them live out in the woods under tarps. If you drive or fly over, which I've done, the Tahuya Forest there, the park, you would be amazed at how many blue tarps there are up in the woods there.
Well, actually, that's a question it's on our list
and
too.
Homelessness later on,
and I know
but
they're
it's kind of tied together.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Maybe just one point that you mentioned treatment centers, and so I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, whether how a lot of those are run locally or run by nonprofits, sometimes private.
Right.
What's the legislature's role in that? What's the state's responsibility?
Well, I know that in the county, a couple of years ago, or actually 3 years ago, they passed that tax to help alleviate it. And I think that, yes, counties need to take care of it as much as they can, because every county is a little bit different, and some of the programs are doing fairly well, I think, but most of them are underfunded or struggling. So I think as a legislator, you want to have some kind of an overseeing situation where you can combine, and you know, counties bleed into each other. For instance, the 35th LD, it's not just Kitsap County or Mason County or Thurston County. So that to have something that coordinates the funding, make sure that it's being used in the correct way, to work with the hospitals, work with the mental health organizations, work with affordable housing and homelessness. All of those things can be, and also the Veterans Administration, all those things I think could be better supervised and looked at more closely. And in my work that I've done as a volunteer, and also just in running for office for the last 2 years ago and then this year, I see a lot of disconnection between many of these organizations. I think that could be improved.
On the local level, that there's
on the local level in relation to the state.
Oh, okay.
And also, of course, funding in the state, and we're going to be getting into that later, I'm sure, about how to fund education. But if we fully fund education, this is the mantra that many people are using, that is also going to affect mental health services and this situation in a very drastic way.
How so? Explain that.
Because there's not enough money for both.
Right. So how do you prioritize it? And you're correct, we will
Well,
ask about education.
Yeah. So before we get off the opiate topic, and then the naloxone, the overdose remedy, I think that should be available to all law enforcement and to people that are dealing with the homeless also, because that's saving lives on a pretty amazing scale, actually. So yeah, there are many issues, social issues. We have an aging population. We have mental health issues. We have homelessness. If we fund education first, which is the new catchphrase now for many politicians, are they also considering how do we fund mental health problems? How do we deal with this opiate problem? Also, I might add that Dan Griffey, my opponent, voted against House Bill 2730, and that is a prescription monitoring program that there were only 16 House members that voted against it. He was one of them, and it passed 80-16. And I, of course, think it's a very good House bill because it gives further monitoring of prescription drugs. And many people start out on painkillers, and then it graduates into other, heroin addiction.
So you don't think
problems.
there's enough monitoring of the prescription drugs by, of the doctors? Is that what you're saying? That they're
Not only
doing that?
doctors, but all health professionals. They're having, it's a major database of noise. So any narcotic, people can't get it in an easy way.
That's what the bill is.
That's what the bill is. It's just tightening up any kind of little slippery places that people can get prescription drugs.
So kind of monitors where.
Yes,
opioids
and
are
so
coming
that
from.
was passed in the last session, but Dan Griffey voted against it.
You mentioned kind of that conundrum about money and how these will be funded, with one of them being very, very important, of course, education. Some of the local efforts are being done for the local sales tax in Mason
Right.
County and Kitsap County, both
Right.
established that. Is that adequate, or do you think the state does need to have its own source of funding for kind of anti-drug and drug prevention efforts?
I think that since the recession, things like dealing with homelessness and mental health issues, I mean, drug addiction is a mental health issue. It's not something separate. And all of those funds have been cut by billions of dollars since 2006. Our economy has improved quite a bit. More money is coming into the coffers. But my concern is by fully funding education, how is that going to affect the issue that we're talking about right now?
Are you in favor of the way the two counties have set up their
I think
prices?
it's terrific, yes. I think it's very, very good.
What are you looking at as far as performance from those? How will you, from a state perspective, judge this is a good thing, or boy, this isn't quite working as we would?
Well, I think, first of all, by talking to the people that are the so-called Marine Corps, the law enforcement, hospital workers, mental health workers, I mean, the people that I've talked to up to this point feel that they're being overwhelmed with the problem. That the problem is growing, and that even though there are some resources, dedicated to that, we want to get ahead of it, And in fact, last year I went to a talk by a group of law enforcement people. It was held up in Poulsbo, and they were talking about the shocking amount of people that are becoming addicted to hard drugs. I mean, when I was a kid, it was like pot or something. It's like we're talking about heroin.
Is there any other sort of way, Jim had kind of asked this question when Dan Griffey was in, but when we were on this topic, when we're talking about people getting hooked on these drugs and the law enforcement angle to it, do you think, funding, I think is where you were going with your statement earlier, saying there just hasn't been enough money for Mason County to do
They're
what they
having
would like
issues
to do.
with the sheriff's department. They're underfunded in many departments. They're very concerned. Sheriff Salisbury has been very concerned about this, so that they're the first responders in most cases. Fire department. There was a man walking down Chico Way the other day. I live on Chico Way, who was practically falling over. And looked like he was in very bad shape, and my sister actually picked him up off the road. He was like walking out in the middle of the street, didn't even know where he was. And it was quite an ordeal getting him to the right spot and helping this man out. But I think if my sister hadn't have stopped and picked him up off the road, I don't know what would have happened to him.
Should we be tougher on those people as more of a deterrent against drug
Tougher
use?
in what way, do you mean?
Should there be tougher laws on drug users in particular? Is that a way to kind of get at this issue? More of a law enforcement deterrent towards these problems? Do you think that would help?
I think a person that's almost dying, I mean, isn't that tough enough? I mean, I don't think that a person should be put in prison because they're falling over from a heroin overdose. I mean, it's a mental health issue. I think the people that are dealing drugs and the people that are kingpins behind this, yes, throw the book at them.
Okay, so how would you propose we do this? Because what I'm saying is, when we were talking yesterday, is that this is a supply-demand issue. You obviously have the demand from the people that are using, but the supply is what's making the drug available.
Right.
And our laws do not in any way stop or hinder drug suppliers, the people that are selling the drugs. And unless you attack the supply side of it and make the laws that are going to stop people using, what's the point of putting all this effort into the other side of it? Because they're just going to go back out and get more.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the problem is that it's so inexpensive, is that the suppliers have made it very inexpensive for people to get it. And also the opiate problem. I mean, a lot of people that are addicted to prescription drugs have now gone into heroin use, and that's what that House bill was trying to address, is like, how are people, there needs to be a tightening up on the state level of prescription drugs that are narcotics.
Yeah,
because people become addicted to this, it's a highly addictive drug, and then they can't get it anymore, that starts to dry up on them, and then they're going out in the street and looking for heroin.
Yet we legalize marijuana. I mean, it's all part of the same thing. So how do you justify that?
Justify what, Jim?
I don't know
Legalize-
quite what your question
Well, I
is,
mean,
I'm sorry.
Drugs are available, and the state has now legalized marijuana, so that's a step in towards the same direction that we're talking about. People using drugs. Marijuana is a drug just like the rest of them are. And yet we say it's okay to use marijuana. And
Well, I mean, we legalize alcohol. Alcohol's a drug. I mean, I don't know. I have friends and they think there's not much difference between marijuana. I don't agree with them, but they don't think there's a difference between marijuana and alcohol, so they think it should be equivalent.
Okay, but we now have a heroin epidemic here in Seattle in our area. And I think that the enforcement has to be much more strict on those that are supplying these drugs than they are right now. And
I would agree with that, but the question that Mr. Nelson gave me was, what about the person that's the drug addict? And should they be put in prison? And I said, no, they should be hospitalized or treated. This is what the treatment centers are. So getting back to the original question, I agree with you 1,000%. Is that anyone that supplies drugs to people, they should be severely reprimanded and put in prison or deported, or I know a lot of people are even coming from out of the country coming into our region and doing this.
But sometimes people become dealers to supply their habit. So there's not always this bright line between the dealer and the addict, is my point.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people in jail for, I don't know, minor, they're dealing, and I'm not going to argue that, but they're not the kingpins. So I don't know if that makes a difference, but I think it should.
Do you support methadone maintenance?
I think in many cases with hardcore drug addicts, if that keeps them off the street and keeps them from going into what we're talking about here with, quasi-dealing and falling over on the side of the highway, yes, I do.
I wanted to ask you about the funding, though. You said it was cut tremendously in 2006 or whatever. Has that funding been restored at the state level? We're talking about now.
No, this is the problem. They're putting it on the counties, and the counties are already under the burden of so many other issues. And so I think that the state needs to step up their game, and I think they shall. I think they shall. Right. Well, I think that the big issue, of course, is funding and getting more money in the pot in our state revenue. Now, the question is how to do that. The last time I ran against Senator Sheldon, words were put into my mouth that I was for a state income tax. I never said that, not at this interview with this paper or in any other venue. However, he used that to help defeat me in the last campaign. I'm saying just front up, I'm not for a state income tax. It was proposed for 7 times in the state, and each time it has been unsuccessful. Okay. I do think that there have been many different issues in regards to stopping additional funding, mainly from the Republican Party, who refuses to acknowledge that corporations, many tax exemptions, these tax loopholes, even if they were all excused, and even if we could make that money come in, still is not enough money to fully fund education and do what we're talking about. But it is a good start. And what I don't understand is how my opponent and other people of his party can say over and over again, fund education first and sort of let the chips fall where they may. It's not logical. It's not mathematically correct. And how can a child go to school if their parents are addicted to drugs? Or how can a child go to school if there are no social programs or other things that a lot of these kids depend on? We have 20% of people in Mason County that are on assisted food stamps, 20%. So what's going to happen? Yeah, we may have the fully funded education, but the kids are hungry. Or you know, we don't have affordable housing for a lot of these families. We have a huge proportion of children in this state that are homeless. So what I'm saying is the math doesn't work out. And I think that we need legislators that are going to look at things carefully and be able to make maybe unpopular decisions, hard decisions, and be able to tell the truth about what our situation truly is. That's one of the reasons I'm running. And I think that a lot of people are hiding behind, you know, fully funded education. That's the paramount duty of the state. I couldn't agree more. I think that it is. Education, if we don't have an educated populace, we're in trouble. And that is one of our main, I'd say.
So how do you propose we solve this problem?
We need to close tax loopholes. We need to bring millions of dollars in revenue in that. There are levy swaps that I think that, especially for the 35th, might work out.
That was actually one of the questions we wanted to ask.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to that. You know, right now we're dependent on property taxes, for instance, and so kids in Bellevue practically live in palaces at their schools. I don't know if you've ever visited any of the schools over there, but they're pretty nice. And then we've got problems like CK luckily just passed a bond and levy capital project bond, and they're going to be building a new high school, but that's the high school my dad went to. He graduated in 1937, you know, and it's the same old place, you know, and they've got rats in the building. So
would you be for something like that?
I'm in favor, especially for rural districts, because we get shafted.
Are there any sort of parameters you feel should put on that? If that swap was enacted, what sort of parameters should then be on a local school district when they do need something? Should there be any ability to still levy? Should that be taken away so it must be from the state? How do you feel about that?
I don't think it should be. I think that school districts, and this is why we have school boards, and this, you know, and I think that who knows better what their own students need than the people that, the parents and the community that's supporting the schools and raising their kids. So I don't like the idea of taking control away from parents or taking control away from school boards. I like local control. I don't think the state or the umbrella of the state has all the answers.
Maybe I ask in terms of tax requests that they could make. To prevent us from getting back into the situation we're in now is the reason I ask this. Let's say we make the property tax levy and then the people in Bellevue say, that's fine, we'll just put another levy on so we can still continue to get so far ahead. Should there be some sort of restriction on what you are allowed to levy for?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'd have to look at that plan a lot more carefully before I can say yes or no on that.
What about teachers' salaries?
Teacher salaries is a different issue. Okay, because a lot of the teacher salaries now are depending, something like 23% now of the schools are depending on support just to pay things like teacher salaries. Luckily, they did pass a COLA this last legislative, after what, 6 or 7 years where there was no increase of salary. But we're losing teachers in Washington State. And the other problem is, you know, people that live in Seattle or teaching in schools, for instance, in downtown Seattle, like Queen Anne, or wherever, they can't afford to live there. They have to commute. They have to live way far away on their, even on their teacher salaries in Seattle, because they can't afford to live in Seattle, because of the
So
high
do you think
rent
they
and
should,
the high.
that the local, we did this swap, would you think that the local school district could still have a levy to increase teacher salaries?
It may be on a case-by-case situation, so if a district is very expensive to live in, if it were a certain amount of radius that, you know, a teacher would have to drive, maybe they could do some supplemental kind of thing to help keep those teachers there. I don't know.
That's what's happening right now. That's why the superintendent of public instruction is suing these 7 different districts, because the teacher's salary is coming out of these local levies.
Of the levies, which is not
And that
right.
is unconstitutional.
Right.
So would you be in favor of changing the Constitution to allow that to happen?
No, that's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that we need to more equalize the whole system across the state, whether it's rural, whether it's Seattle. However, I'm not saying that necessarily we should take away the options for individual school districts or boards to determine what they need for those particular
So
schools.
that's law.
Should they negotiate the teacher salaries statewide? Should that be done at one level rather than individual districts negotiating with their unions?
You mean collective bargaining?
Yes.
Yes. I don't know. Because I think that collective bargaining is very important, but again, what someone gets paid in Bellevue and what someone gets paid in Mason County and the cost of living and all of those adjustments.
But doesn't that feed into this? I mean, you mentioned the situation in Seattle, people struggling, but I know the rural districts often lose teachers because
They're not paying them
the
enough.
pay is so low, and so
Right.
so it's hard to get young people to go to some of these places. And whether if you
Right.
had a statewide salary scale,
Right.
would that help sort of even things out a little bit? So
I
you
think
could
it could. I think it definitely could.
But you
yeah.
don't know if you'd be in favor of voting for negotiating with the state rather than negotiating with individual districts.
I think that, what you're trying to do is box me in on this one way or the other. I'm saying, first of all, we don't even have funding options figured out yet. There's a panel that's trying to work on that right now. The levy situation, we all acknowledge, is no good. And we also acknowledge that we have a tremendous problem with housing and cost of living between rural districts and city districts. We also have a problem with charter schools versus public schools. The whole thing is kind of a mess.
But it's up to the legislature
Exactly.
to fix this problem. And now we're facing around $30 million in fines to the legislature for not solving this problem.
I agree.
And the leadership in Olympia has got to take the bull by the horns and make this happen.
Right?
And I don't know how I have sympathy for you. I don't know how you're going to solve this and at the same time provide the necessary funding for the mental health problems that we have at the same time. I don't know how you're going to do it.
It's a big
Maybe-
question.
maybe I can
ask
ask
a more
something.
general question here, which may help in your question. So, in order to fully fund education, you have to have a pretty good idea of what your target is.
Right.
And there seems to be some disagreement on what fully funding education really means. Are you comfortable, do you have an opinion, or do you feel confident that you know what fully funded education really means, so you know how much money you need? There seems to be some disagreement with some folks. So how do you feel about
I
that?
agree with you on that. I think that there is some dispute. Some people are saying 3 billion, some people are going up as far as like 8 billion. So that's one thing
Do
again.
you have a comfortable view of that?
What's your
What's your
position?
position?
I would want to know what it is that we're paying for, and we would need transparency on that. I don't think just throwing more money after things is necessarily going to solve the problem. But when I was taking my Seattle sound effects business, this was back in 2007, over to some of the school districts in Seattle, some of those schools couldn't even pay for pencils. I talked to the principal. This one school in Beacon Hill had 23 languages that the kids speak. It's an all-immigrant population school. I also had my business, Seattle Sound Effects, that went over to Bellevue. And so the disparity within a like 15-mile radius was mind-boggling. I don't think we see that as much here in Kitsap County,
Well,
but if
we
you
see
go
it,
to
though.
Seattle,
What does that tell you is missing, maybe from the definition of basic education then?
well, first of all, we need pencils.
clearly pencils in the
You know,
collection.
we need some basic school supplies. Some of the teachers said that they were actually dipping into their own salaries to pay for things to
Didn't
put into
report
the
them,
classroom for the kids.
You know, I wonder, maybe you should go to the one about the tax structure or something. Because it seems to me some of this gets to more basic problems of inequities, so.
Let me get there in just a minute. I'm going to kind of continue to push on what Bart's saying. You know, supplies, clearly, yeah, that's kind of, and I think that's already kind of that's accepted among everyone as basic education. What I'm trying to push at is there's things that are, you know, do you see, we've always just talked about K through 12. What about community college? Should that be included when we have this conversation about education? Should preschool be included when you have this? Because that changes the amount considerably on what you're looking at.
Right.
That's the kind of thing I'm trying to ask.
Full-time
When you look at
kindergarten,
what
for
they've been
instance,
talking
early
about,
learning
do you think
programs.
we're missing things? Do you think we're putting things in there that no, we don't need to be that, that's how we save some money?
Well,
What's
of
your
course, you're talking to a teacher. You're talking to someone that I have been teaching since I was 13 years old. I'm 59 years old. And so my first and most passionate mission in life has been to teach people and young people. So I don't feel that really any amount of money or anything that we do for our next generation is wasted. That we all will benefit from that exponentially. I think there's graft oftentimes. I think that sometimes our administrators and some of the top people that are making some of the decisions, I wonder how they get the paychecks that they do, especially considering the results that we have. I wonder about that quite a bit. I think that teachers do a tremendous amount of work. I don't think there's hardly a harder job on earth than being a teacher. And also, you're not just dealing with that student or that individual that walks into your classroom. You are dealing with their family. You're dealing maybe with their grandparents. You're dealing with their neighbors. You're dealing with all kinds of social issues to try to make sure that that child develops into a functioning, pretty stable, productive person in our society. And there is nothing more important than
I
that.
guess the question that I'm trying to get at is that I think we would all agree that you can never have too much money for education. So I think we agree with you there. What I want to know is how would you know when we're fully funded? What's the marker, what's the target for knowing when we're fully funded? We can say that more is better no matter what, but when will we be in compliance with the clarity, and how will you know when we get there?
I think that many schools are doing very well. Many schools that have the levy system in place, that have the property taxes and the populace and the people that can afford to put their money into their schools are doing very well. And the test scores and the fact that these kids are going into universities and getting scholarships, et cetera, that's an indication that, yeah, these kids are learning something, they're being successful, they're doing well. Then you can look at other school districts which are desperately poor, and their test scores are very bad, the dropout rate is high, the teachers are discouraged, huge turnover in staff constantly. Obviously, you can look at those stats and say, okay, this school is really struggling, and the kids that are coming out of this school are struggling.
So is it just a question of transferring resources from one area to another? In other words, transferring some of those, maybe.
Well, that's what the levy swap is supposed to
So
try to
will
address,
that address-
right?
But how will
That's-
that increase the funding available?
Because,
It'll be equally
because,
distributed.
yes, some of those basic things will be more equally distributed. You know, the question that you came up with was then can people also put additional money into that? And my feeling is that's up to the school board, that's up to the community. Will that cause further problems down the line, like you brought up, Mr. Stark? Could, you know, but all these things can be addressed and looked at carefully. But I don't think there's like one simple, like we have to do this, this, and this. And it's going to solve the problem. As you just mentioned, this is a highly complex problem. And we got here through a period of many years.
But isn't
This
that
did not
exactly
happen
what
overnight.
the legislature is being asked to do? To address?
Exactly. And
So
that's
what-
the
so
main
maybe-
reason that I'm running for this office.
Maybe then what's the first step? How about that? How about
First
You're
step
saying-
is to look at this committee that has been assigned to look at these things and come up with solutions. For revenue, what does it mean to fully fund education? What is basic? What is not basic? Transparency, who's responsible for what agencies, what groups will be working together on this, okay? So that's the first thing, is let's get all of our facts, all of our data. You can't make decisions if you've got $8 billion from one person and $4 billion from another, okay? So I think that's the first step, is to try to get this information, and that they have, you know, because the legislature has had, because of McCleary, which I think is a good thing, because it's forced us to put their feet to the fire and say, we can't brush this off anymore. We can't put this off. You have to address this. You have to act like adults and grown-ups and solve this problem. That's what we're hiring you to do. Well, I think the B&O tax, and I'm a small business person, I think it's a very, I think it discourages entrepreneurs and it discourages new people that want to get into business. I have a son that would like to get into a new business. We were looking over all of this very carefully. It's kind of amazing, really, because whether you make a profit or not, you're still taxed. So it's not based on profit. And so that discourages or actually causes many businesses to fail. So if people have the opportunity to develop business, and if the state can support them in that, you're going to ultimately have more people as consumers. You're going to have more people that are willing to pay into the school systems, for instance. You're going to have less jobless. You know, I mean, I think that small business support is very, very important. I also think that the big corporations need to pay their fair share. We need to have a more equitable distribution of who's paying for what. Right now, as you just mentioned, the working class is really bearing the brunt of it. It's all on our shoulders.
There was a very large tax incentive given to Boeing a few years ago.
Yes.
Would you have voted for that or against it?
Absolutely not. I am shocked that, that they have exported our jobs as a Washington state legislator. Why they allowed that to go through without strings attached is beyond belief.
So I'm getting the sense, when you look at tax exemptions, I mean, we've talked about this years, every legislative candidate we get into talking about this, because it's easy to say it.
Right.
Apparently it's incredibly difficult to do because it seems to keep coming up. You're talking about helping small businesses and then forcing corporations to do something differently. What do you define a small business as?
A small business is a person like me who makes about $120,000 a year in my small business that I've had for 36 years now, and helped raise a family on.
20 employees, 50 employees, 100 employees?
Oh, no, I think the
definition?
maximum I had was 8 employees.
Oh, no, I'm saying in your definition.
Oh, in definition, yeah, I mean, I would say anywhere from 5 to whatever, you know. In other words, we're not talking about a big corporation, okay? And a small business, we are kind of the bread and butter of our communities. You know, we feed into the county, we feed into our property taxes, we have services that we give to our communities.
Are there other exemptions you've seen that you disagree with and say, boy, that is just wrong what we're allowing right now?
Well, I have a whole list of them, but I mean, I don't want to bore.
Give me an example.
Okay. Because I couldn't memorize all these, it was just kind of amazing.
It's not a quiz.
Capital gains excise tax on investment profits. If we got rid of that, that's $570 million that we could bring into the state. Expand small business tax credit and reinstate service B&O surtax, $532 million. You know, even like repeal the exemption on sales tax on bottled water. That one alone is $44.4 million. Anyway, I've created a list here that came up with $1,486.7 million.
So
These are just
over
like,
$1 billion.
Yeah, this is like 8 things. And we have 640 that have been identified that don't need to be, you know, that we're protecting, in many cases, multinational corporations. They're not even in this state.
These aren't the loopholes vehicles either, are they?
No, these are tax exemptions.
Right.
So when you add, you know, in other words, these things could be investigated and we could gain a lot of money from this. However, my opponent has voted against taking any action on this.
Any action on what? Every one of those?
Yeah, this was all in the last session. These were listed. These particular ones were listed. And they were all shot down by, it was passed in the House, and it was shot down by the Republican-controlled Senate. So this is what I'm saying. When you say fund education first, well, first of all, where are you getting that funding, and are you going to have the courage to go after some of these tax exemptions and loopholes and make these big corporations pay? Are you going to go after Boeing and say, no, we're not going to give you that money, especially, and ship out 7,000 jobs out of our state? That is not the job of a Washington state legislator. They need to protect Washington state citizens. Pardon?
We lost the jobs to South Carolina and the other plant that's being built down when we gave them the exemption.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Right.
That shouldn't have been done.
So
at least we'd have the money. That would be helping pay for education and the other things that we need, and opiate abuse and everything else. So in other words, are we going to let the big corporations and these guys get away with as much as they can, which they've been doing, or are we going to put their feet to the fire and say, no, wait a minute, Washington state citizens and our needs come first?
So if they move to another state, then those jobs are gone.
So are we
If
supposed
we don't give them the exemption.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
That's what they threatened, that's what told me.
Well, you can't.
I don't believe it.
Well, it happened with the Boeing company.
No, it didn't.
No, it
Well,
didn't.
They did
That's not
open a
true.
new plant.
Then why did we give them the exemption?
To keep the
Yeah,
condition.
we didn't give
That
them all
happened
we
before
didn't
that
give them
exemption
all
was
they
done.
wanted.
Yeah.
So in addition to supporting small businesses, what other steps would you take to try and somehow address the regressive tax system we have?
So I think that's what she was mentioning, a lot of these.
What we've been talking about these last few minutes, you know, a lot of closing loopholes, looking at tax exemptions are one of the major things that we could do right now. And every time that's brought up in the legislature, it gets shot down by the Republicans.
But how
Yeah, I'm really happy that they've appointed now a so-called homeless problem czar. You know, in other words, just what you're saying. I think it's a really good first step, is to get one particular person that can combine and oversee all these different agencies. So I think that the governor just made that decision, and I totally agree with him on that. I think that was a very good move. I'm kind of amazed that we have, I was looking at some statistics, that we have about 20,000 chronically homeless people here in Washington State, and half of those people are families. So again, that goes back into this idea of education. What do we do with the kids that are homeless? You know, how are they going to get an education, and what kind of social services and relief will they have? Nationally, 3.9 million homeless. Huge amount of people. I see in especially Mason County, we have a tremendous lack of affordable housing. So I think that it's cheaper to have a house and to have a place that a person can live in than trying to deal with them and all the other related issues out in the forest or out in the woods. We also have another factor that I think a lot of people have not been talking about, but by 2030, we're going to have 1 in 4 people that are going to need long-term elder care. So a lot of and they do not have the retirement funds or the money to pay for that. So this is, I think, a coming crisis. Right now in 2016, we're talking about education. But what I'm very concerned about is in 10, 15 years, we have a progressively aging population, but we do not have the funding, and people personally do not have the funding to really be able to afford long-term care. So this also will feed into this homeless problem. Because if people can't afford to live in their homes, they can't, I spend a lot of time doorbelling, you know, as part of the campaign process, where you knock on a door, you go to someone's house, say, well, you know, introduce yourself and say, what are the things, the issues that you have? I can't tell you how many homes that I've knocked on in Kitsap, Thurston, and especially Mason, where there are elderly people, there are tarps over their roofs, they have wood over windows that they can't replace because they don't have the money to do it.
So is it the state's job to start building housing?
I think the state could certainly combine with maybe some other agencies or other departments and other charitable organizations. Again, hopefully this homeless czar, now that they've just hired, can come up with some of these solutions. But I do think it's a problem, not only in relation to the drug addiction or mental health issues. I think it's a disgrace that we have veterans that are living out in the woods. And then, of course, our elderly population. And I think this is going to be...
Medicaid picks up a huge...
If you're under $2,000.
Well, you certainly will soon be.
Well, you will once you lose every single thing you own and
right.
everything you have, you see, and this is no good. And so then, when we're looking at 2030, we won't have the money in the state to pay for this. Not at the given revenue.
On the affordable housing,
in.
do you think that is something that we could make it, you know, that developers could develop this, you know, given some changes either in zoning or requirements or...
They've tried that in many areas and in many states. It's had varying success, but in the most part, not been too successful. I was looking at some of the stats on that. You know, they'll give certain, again, tax breaks to a building development company to say, okay, we'll have a certain amount for affordable housing or whatever. It hasn't worked out as well as they thought. So I'm not so sure that's ultimately the solution. I think that what Utah did, and I did read up on that before this interview, was very interesting, very interesting. But it's actually cheaper to put these people in a home than to have them out in the street.
Housing first. I have a quick question.
I think minimum wage is very important. I am voting. I am for it. Absolutely. Yeah.
You don't, from a business perspective, you don't worry that would hurt your business.
Not my business, not my particular. In fact, the people that I have employed get paid way, way above the minimum wage because of the kind of service that I offer. But I think that if your employers are well trained, if they're happy, if they can afford to buy the services that they need, then it benefits everybody.
I think Bart has a similar initiative.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I mean, initially, when I first heard about the carbon tax about, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, and I heard the speakers, the man that came up with the idea, and is an economist and was talking about it. Initially, I thought it was really a great idea because it would be appealing to both business owners and non-business owners. It would be, you know, it's tax neutral, in other words. And I definitely feel that we need to address the problem. I agree with Governor Inslee that we have a real issue about acidification of our waters. And if you go to Taylor Shellfish or you look at the shellfish industry, they're taking little baby oysters and taking them to Hawaii. You were just talking about being in Hawaii. They actually have to take them out there so they get big enough so they can retransplant them into the waters. So I don't think that people are disputing anymore the science, at least in this area, about how it's going to affect the shellfish industry, fishing industry. The tribes are very, very concerned about this. And also, we have a lot more forest fires, a lot of fire problems. I was talking to Green Diamond, that owns about 25% of the real estate in Mason County, and discussed with them some issues about, you know, tree tree growth and fire danger.
But-
So this is obviously a very important subject, especially for the 35th LD and for our industries. And so protecting natural resources is something I'm very concerned about. Now, getting back to your original question on the initiative, the unions and a lot of other organizations and the state Democratic Party has come out against it. And because they do not think that it addresses the issue of people of low income that are mostly in areas that are the highest pollution areas. And they want an initiative that is more, more socially sensitive to where people are actually living in relation to environmental pollutants and that sort of thing. And so that's one of their main reasons that they feel that the initiative that you're talking about wasn't really addressing that. There are other pros and cons with Jay Ensley's proposal. So I think that on one hand, I'm just happy that they're actually getting these things on the table, that there's so many people that are really, really interested in this. I think there's no doubt that we have to address this. I think the verdict is out though, and I would really like to see maybe a combination of plans or maybe some things tweaked a little bit more here in the next couple of years. But I think that there will be some definite changes in how we are working with the environment, and that's a good thing. Right, well, I think that the main thing as an educator and as a parent and as a member of our community and a long time, member of Kitsap County in particular, I'm very concerned about what everyone was voicing here, about how are we going to fund education, how are we also going to keep a certain standard of social services that obviously we need. There are tremendous forces and needs like the opiate problem, homelessness, mental health. I just lost a student recently, not her luckily, but her whole family was killed by a mentally ill person in Belfair. And my student was the only survivor of that whole family. And so it hits home to me in my own life and in my own personal work. And we read about it every day in the newspapers. So I think as a state legislator, the main ingredient that you need is you need to be passionate about it and you need to care about people. And I truly do. So I think that if that's a qualification for the job, you're looking at it, okay? Secondly, I think that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that always looking at an initiative, like for instance the carbon tax, looking at different ideas, maybe pulling back a little bit and saying, okay, who is this really hurting? Who is this really benefiting? How much is it going to cost? But the bottom line is it has to benefit the citizens of Washington State, and not just the 1% at the top, but the majority of people. My main concern is for the working class in our state, because we are the backbone of this state. This is what our responsibility, I believe, as legislators are, is to protect the education, the health, the prosperity, and if you can even put it this way, happiness of our citizens here in this state. So we need to protect the services and the things that we already have offered. I think there are many great things that we have to offer here in the state, and I want to preserve those things, including our park systems, our wonderful natural resources. We don't have a Department of Tourism. Why? We have the most beautiful, why are we advertising on the ferries Montana or Canada or something? We should be advertising our own state. We're missing out on a tremendous business opportunity there. So there are lots of things that I think that we can really tweak and adjust and change. But we are a great state, and we want to preserve that and improve it.
Well, thanks. Appreciate your time. Good conversation.